Welcome to the webinar, Finding the Sweet Spot of Packaging Innovation. My name is Kristen Marshall, Associate Research Director here at Lux, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues Derek Gingrich, Director of Anthropology, and Matilda Della Fontana, Senior Research Associate here at Lux Research. And apologies, today we are actually having technical difficulties, so we are going to have our cameras off for the remainder of the session. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on the screen, and then time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can at the end of the session. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will get back to you in a short amount of time. Now, let's jump to the presentation. Matilda, Derek, take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine, and welcome everybody. I want to start today's webinar with an example of a few years ago. I don't know if any of you remember the infamous Sun Chips bags from PepsiCo in 2010. But PepsiCo back in the days wanted to innovate their packaging and make it more sustainable and decided to use a new material for those time that was PLA. So PepsiCo was presumably successful in developing a packaging that adequately packaged its Sun Chips. But the reality is that these bags suffer from a completely different issue because they were significantly lighter than conventional chip bags. So shortly after, the launch on the market, consumers started black caching PepsiCo on social media and releasing this video, and we were just like crushing the bags to communicate how louder they were. So I really like to bring this example every time up because usually companies looking to innovate their packaging, in this case at bio-based alternatives, generally consider things like shelf life, durability, tensile strength, cost of the new materials. But like any other products, consumer opinion is what really drives sale, and is something that product developers cannot overlook. So in the case of PepsiCo, right, putting a compostable label can for sure spark sales at the beginning, but there are some unintended consequences of incorporating bio-based material that can actually cause more harm than good. Because at the end, right, good packaging protects your products, but great packaging protects your brand. And I think that this is really important, especially in today's scenario where packaging has garnered considerable attention for its contribution to escalating issues like, plastic waste accumulation, generation of microplastic, greenhouse gases emission. And the packaging industry has been really slow in responding to shifting needs and satisfy requirements of brand impact. And this, in my opinion, really underscores what I call the paradox of the packaging sector, that is an industry known for its conservative nature, yet with an urgent need for innovation. So in today's webinar, I really want to touch on the three variables that are shaping the future of sustainable packaging and understand how they contribute to building an effective packaging strategy. On the second part, we're gonna touch on the consumer piece of the sustainable packaging equation, and we're gonna understand how we capture consumer consensus around specific topics that in this case are gonna be antiplastic sentiment, packaging, safety, and greenwashing. And we're gonna conclude with some final consideration. So if we think of the packaging equation, right, the first piece is technology development. It really helps achieve a suitable balance among packaging performance, cost, processing, and end of life. And here, making one feature better isn't complicated, but doing so without compromising other features is the real challenge. Because ultimately, packaging must become more sustainable without any compromises. The second piece that we need to look at are global regulation. So they come in all shape and size and vary from one region to to another. And we have seen in the form of taxes, extended producer responsibility schemes, labeling requirement, or specific bans on items or chemical formulation. But this regulation can really push certain technology and material developments onto the marketplace and anchor innovative solutions within the corporate business. And lastly, the third piece is consumer acceptance, right? That play a critical role in the successful rollout of new packaging solution and should be top of mind when brands are making decisions. Because we have seen that it's not enough to have a good product. It needs to be adopted to make a difference. So here is clear that we have these three pieces of packaging innovation, and a successful, sustainable packaging solution needs to fall where there is an overlap between these three pieces. And this overlap is what we call the sweet spot of packaging innovation. And if one of more of the elements of the sweet spot is not mature, then the sweet spot itself may be very small or even non-existent, and no solution are within reach at this time. And throughout our conversation with corporation, we understand that most of the time brands incorporate more readily insights on emerging regulation and technology developments. But most of the time, the missing part of the equation is consumer consensus, right? Because without consumer insights, brands will not put forth an effective, sustainable strategy. But how do we capture this consumer consensus? This is the big question. And for this reason, today, I invited our Director of Anthropology at Motive-Based, Derek, to help us unpack the consumer piece of packaging innovation regarding some thematic questions that we are actively addressing from a technology and regulation point of view. So Derek, really welcome. And my first question to you is, how do we capture this consumer consensus?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Matilda. I'm really excited to be here. So at Lux, we look at consumer consensus through the lens of structural anthropology in a process that we refer to as predictive anthropology. Basically, we understand culture through language. We study reams of natural language conversations from anonymous places on the internet where people can post without attaching their name to it. Think places like Reddit or at the comment section on a news article. And by analyzing how people use language when discussing a topic, like, for example, packaging, we decode what those topics mean to people. The predictive element of that then is that we take these meanings and we determine how solid or how volatile, how kind of concrete and set of meanings are versus if it's still volatile and flux. And we determine how mature those meanings are as a result and sort of predict where we anticipate those meanings to develop in the future. We're going to be primarily concerned with a topic like packaging with two broad areas of maturity, what we call early consensus and mainstream acceptance, where early consensus is that point in time where there's definitely meanings settling. People are starting to agree what something like packaging means, for example, if it sits in the early consensus, but there's still lots of room for disruption. There's not a total, solid, strong, agreed upon set of definitions. Whereas when something's moving into that mainstream acceptance phase of things, the culture's expanded. People are really agreeing what the topic means to them in their life. And more importantly, the market is perfectly poised for like an innovative solution now. So once it hits mainstream acceptance, people are looking for a solution. Whereas early consensus, we're still sort of coming to terms with what something means to us in our lives.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Derek. And I believe that we can really use, this insight from the work that you're doing and try to benchmark them against global regulation and technology development, right? In this way, we can use this Venn diagram to really highlight where the strong interconnection are, as well as gaps preventing companies from achieving an effective packaging strategy. And I really now would like to move into the great part of our discussion and start touching on the three themes. And I would like to start with anti-plastic sentiment, because I feel that this is a thematic area that most companies, where most companies feel the need of innovation. So now I'm curious also, from a consumer point of view. And what I would like to ask you is, do consumers feel there are more sustainable options compared to plastic? And how do they feel about different type of materials that could be paper, aluminum, plastic, glass?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're talking about consumers' understanding around plastic, this is a culture that currently sits in that early consensus stage where people are still determining what plastic means to them in their lives, what plastic means for the planet, what they can and can't expect plastic to do and be. But it's expected to grow in the next couple of years into that mainstream acceptance stage. So we're really looking at a culture that we expect to become mainstream shortly. And therefore, this is a culture that is really, really, really well primed for solutions. People are sort of waiting for a solution they can latch onto to really solidify meanings around. What meanings are building and starting to generate around plastic is this idea that, as you asked, if there's materials more sustainable than plastic, and the sort of pithy answer to that would be more or less everything. Consumers definitely see paper, glass, aluminum as more sustainable than plastic if they're just thinking about sustainability. They think paper is simpler. It composts, they understand that. Glass, they feel like it's easier to recycle and it can be reused, especially if it's an aesthetically pleasing glass bottle. If it's something pretty, they can reuse it in different ways. And if it's aluminum, they feel like aluminum recycling is more solid and has a better track record or history compared to how they understand plastic recycling, given increasing news stories about plastic not actually being recycled, maybe being shipped overseas. Maybe they're reading op-eds about how most of the plastic they throw in their recycling bin actually ends up in the landfill in their municipality. They're really starting to think that plastic itself at the end of its life isn't actually as recyclable as they thought. And so every other major material they're used to thinking about as packaging, they see as more sustainable.
That's really interesting, right? Because if we now try to look also at the anti-plastic sentiment from a regulation and technology point of view, I believe that really this sentiment is mostly aligned with what we are seeing. And it's interesting that you are addressing anti-plastic sentiment from an end-of-life point of view when it comes to consumer. Because from what we are seeing, it's also important to evaluate factors such as carbon footprint and sustainable sourcing. And, several alternatives to plastic exist. Ranging from long-standing choice like glass to emerging ones like pulp and paper packaging. So really, when evaluating potential alternative, it's crucial to consider the ability for us to match the performance of existing solution, and at the same time, make a switch that is data-backed with analysis on the environmental impact that goes beyond just like end of life, right? Just to be sure that the alternatives is not creating more harm than good. For example, glass packaging, its production is really like energy intensive and high carbon emitting. And compared to plastic, there are some cases it has lower durability, limiting its application potential. Same goes with aluminum. But if I think about, thinking from an end-of-life point of view and a solution to traditional plastic packaging that also could meet the consumer and government's needs, I'm thinking about monomaterial packaging. Because monomaterial packaging from a technological point of view is something that has been widely researched. And we have seen a lot of large corporations across the globe really investing in this solution and already being commercial in some case. At the same time, it really goes well with what regulation across the globe are mandating in this moment. If you think about the decrease in use of virgin plastic, enable better recyclability and the possibility to incorporate more recycled content, because monomaterial packaging theoretically is something that can be easy recycled, but of course it depends also on the infrastructure currently in place. But here is where, Derek, I'm wondering, because monomaterial packaging could also answer consumer needs of having a easier disposal, because it's just one material and they can throw it in their plastic recycling bin, but it's still plastic. So in your opinion, would the consumer in this case accept an innovation like monomaterial packaging?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing to think back on is the fact that this is still an early consensus for a reason, right? If there was a perfect solution for people on the market right now, this would be a well-established idea. If they think plastic is bad and harmful for the planet and not recyclable, and there was a clear, easy alternative, like glass filled every single one of their wants and needs, then the switch would be easy, the meetings would be settled, there wouldn't be this room for disruption and innovation. But plastic does a lot of things for consumers that the other alternatives simply don't do. If you think of something like a squeeze bottle for shampoo or hand cream, or even something like mustard, that plastic material that the squeeze bottle is made out of, they can roll it up, it's easy to squeeze out, it's easy to cap on. If that's what you're used to using, that's what you like to use, it does everything that you want. Whereas something like an aluminum tube, you have to really kind of keep rolling it as you go. You get little cuts and nicks in it. And it simply doesn't work as well from their perspective, even before it hits end of life. Or another common alternative would be a glass bottle with a pump. And there you see this multiple material thing very vividly as just a person using hand soap. You see the glass bottle, you see the plastic pump, you see the metal spring. And if you're eco-conscious, or if you're concerned about recycling, et cetera, properly, you have to ask yourself, how do I have to dismantle this? Do the different pieces go to different locations? And this is obviously a very visual example of a piece of packaging being made out of multiple materials, more immediately visible than something like a paper cup lined in plastic. So from a consumer's perspective, one of the big problems with plastic is that it's complicated. It seems they have to check the recyclable symbol and see what is recyclable and what isn't. They have to learn what their municipality can recycle. Maybe they have to separate different plastic from the lid and the bottle. And then the problems that plastic recycling runs into, as they understand it, are results of how complicated plastic is. So anything that can convince consumers that plastic has been made simpler, such as monomaterial plastic, and that simplicity both makes their lives simpler at end of life. They don't have to worry about separating in order to make the right or eco-conscious choice, but also makes the recycling process simpler, is definitely a direction where you can get consumers to latch onto, especially if this monomaterial plastic performs as well from their perspective. It integrates into their lives just as well as the plastic packaging they use right now.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. Thank you, Derek. So yeah, plastic is something complex. This is really true. And also we are seeing different type of plastic being used that adds complexity and the end of life. But of course, performance is another big factor in consumer purchasing behavior when it comes to packaging. And that leads me, to the next theme that I would like to address with you. And it's like, the presence of chemicals in packaging and the use of a specific type of plastic or additives that are used to make the material perform better. And at the same time, add also complexity, as we were talking before. So specifically when it comes to safety, right, I want to delve into consumer perception, including the awareness of different chemicals in packaging, because we are seeing, for example, the scientific community really emphasizing the significance of addressing this matter with greater urgency. So when it comes to consumer, how does the presence of toxic substance that could be PFS, polyvinyl chloride, for example, within packaging really affect consumer choices? And are consumers willing to adopt innovative packaging solution, even if they perceive they do not guarantee the same product freshness and quality?
Yeah, that's another great question. Of course, from a consumer perspective, the sort of king of chemicals in packaging is still BPA, because they're familiar with concerns about BPA that arose in the context of water bottles many years ago and still lives strongly within their understanding of safety when it comes to packaging and concerns around packaging. When we talk about packaging and safety, this is a culture that sits in the early consensus and is expected to stay there for the short term, meaning that this is a space that's very prone to disruption. Consumers are still very unsettled about what safety means to them in terms of chemicals and packaging, but we do expect growth in the same direction. So we expect everything we're talking about to kind of continue to solidify, but it's much further off, and there's much more space to disrupt this place. And when consumers discuss safety in terms of packaging, it's less about, for example, toxic chemicals getting into the environment, although that does, those conversations do occur around this sort of savviest consumers, but more specifically, consumers are concerned about how the chemicals in packaging can leach into their body through the products the packaging is for. So consumers are especially concerned about chemicals and what they would call toxins in packaging when that packaging is holding food or personal care products, be that toothpaste or, again, like something like face cream. And they're discussing a wide ream of different chemicals, with BPA being the primary concern, but we see conversations around phthalates, PFAS, plasticizers, and even styrene among the more savvy consumers as well. And the real concern here is that if the packaging has this toxin and this toxin transfers from the packaging and leaches into the product that I put on or in my body, how does that threaten my health and my safety? When consumers are discussing alternatives to the kind of what they see as the chemical packaging, we see, for example, conversations around glass as an alternative for something like dry goods, where they feel like glass does not leach chemicals into their food. But once more, we run into those same usability concerns that we saw that motivate anti-plastic sentiment in general.
Mm-hmm. No, that totally makes sense. And it's really interesting, right? Because if I try to benchmark everything you just said against regulation and technology, what we are seeing is just little alignment. Despite we are policy promoting a technology development and to some extent really mirroring some consumer concerns regarding chemicals, because among the long list of chemicals of concern, for example, PFS in consumer packaging has been identified as a major priority by regulators, right? Because there are these forever chemicals that from the packaging leaks into the food and then into the human body, and that can cause a big health threat. But for me, it's really interesting also to understand why technology development really struggle to keep up with regulation. And the reality is that there is a big uncertainty regarding which sustainable alternatives to use. Because right now, there are no industry standards or agreement on which is going to be the safer formulation to bet in the long term. Because for a long time, we have looked at bio-based material, for example, either as substrate, additives, or filler. But most of the time, this solution really struggled to match incumbent performance and supply. And this creates big concern. And we are seeing this concern coming also from a lot of our clients. And they need to comply with this emerging regulation that bans these unsafe chemicals. But at the same time, as was mentioned before, sometimes the performance is not the same. So I'm also wondering here, right? You mentioned that the freshness is something important, but how much are consumers willing to sacrifice under this point of view? Are they accepting something that is safer for their health in terms of packaging, but might lead to a shorter shelf life of the packaged product?
Yeah, that's interesting. So from a consumer perspective, freshness and safety of the packaging are sort of on a continuum in that they're both, at the end of the day, an impact on their health, and that's really what they're evaluating. So you mentioned biodegradable packaging. That's a great example, because even though consumers are interested in biodegradable packaging from what we see from a sustainability standpoint, as soon as you're talking about things that need to be kept fresh, like food, we do see some concerns about biodegradable packaging emerging. Mainly, if something's meant to biodegrade, as they understand it, if something's meant to break down, then there's the risk that the packaging itself breaks down into the product they want. And that is sort of on a continuum with chemicals leaching, like BPA leaching from a plastic water bottle into their water, versus this biodegradable alternative also decomposing into their water, again, as they understand it. That's not a clear trade-off. That's not clearly better to them. So freshness really does, obviously, there's a little leeway always, but freshness is a part of health. Fresh food is healthier for them. Fresh skincare products are healthier for them. And the problem with the chemical-based packaging is, again, that threat to their health. So it both need to be in alignment from a consumer perspective. It needs to be healthier for me.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And I know that you mentioned before, consumer fearing that with unsafe formulation, it could leak into the environment if we are considering a biodegradable packaging. But here, and it leads me to our last theme really, is we are seeing companies nowadays using a lot of buzzword. For example, biodegradable packaging, compostable packaging, natural packaging that leads to freshened foods. But here is, with all this buzzword, my question is, how do consumers feel about company sustainability claims? Do they think they're just marketing strategy? And what are their level of understanding of the different definition of sustainable packaging, considering also this big theme of greenwashing?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I mean, from a consumer perspective, greenwashing, this whole culture is very volatile, meaning that consumers don't have a clear direction. They're not 100% sure what to do about it and what direction to move in it. And it's simply because there's a bunch of different conflicting desires and thoughts. On the one hand, people want to do better for the planet by making more sustainable choices. On the other hand, they don't think corporations really care about the planet. They care about their profits. And so they're suspicious of sustainability claims made by a corporation or sustainable innovations made by a corporation because they think there's a hidden trick that to increase profits and to kind of help the planet as little as possible without harming one's profits. So they think there's kind of a game being played. But at the same time, they don't think they can just avoid these large corporations and focus on their own footprint. They can't just live a more sustainable lives themselves, because one individual, as they understand it, trying to live more sustainability isn't going to affect large-scale change. What needs to happen is these corporations do need to make choices that are better for the planet and more sustainable. So they don't think they can fix the problem by themselves, but they're also suspicious of corporate solutions. And they're always looking for what the trick is, especially after there's been large greenwashing scandals. And from the consumer perspective, the greatest of which is plastic itself. They view plastic recycling as a big greenwash.
Yeah, that is really interesting and right on point, because, what we are seeing is that these consumer fears about greenwashing are really like well reflected in emerging regulation across the globe. Governments are really taking stricter position to prevent companies from making inconsistent or misleading claims. If we think about the European Union, it recently passed a law that is proposing a plan to prevent false environmental claims on product labels, including this item can be recycled, because we all know that recyclability has a lot of complexity behind, and it's not always the case, but just like by labeling something as recyclable. We are seeing also, like in the US recently, that the Federal Trade Commission launched a review of the guides for the use of environmental claims. But here, I believe that when it comes to really communicate sustainability is really difficult for companies, right? So technology are needed to allow these companies to really communicate data in an accurate and reliable way, right? So we are seeing things like digital tagging and labeling that can store information related to a product's identity and a sustainability indicator, and that can really be used to trace and authenticate a product's origin and material composition. But unfortunately, this technology are kind of a still niche solution that involve high cost, and that is limiting, for example, their potential for mass adoption in packaging. But something that we are seeing being used more and more recently are QR codes. So QR codes can be put on packaged labels, and consumer can scan them to have access to all these sustainability metrics. So do you think, Derek, that something like that could help consumer trust a little bit more corporation, or is not a solution here?
I think things like QR codes definitely help and can work, but maybe not in the way that you think. From most people's perspective, they're not going to scan the QR code more than once if they're ever going to scan it, because they understand at the end of the day that A, they probably can't understand this traceability information, and B, there is that level of suspicion where they might be a little suspicious of what's being left out, or how the information that they're getting by scanning is being traced. But that transparency that the QR code offers is very important, because even if they don't engage with it often, or even if they don't have the skills to read about it, they use that QR code to join a community that is discussing it and is analyzing it. So maybe I'm not going to trust a corporation's QR code to be all the way on the level, but maybe I'm a member of a large online community on Reddit about greenwashing, or maybe I go to a blog like greenwash.com where there are community members I trust analyzing the contents of those QR codes and giving their input. That kind of community building aspect is very important, and it allows consumers to get a second opinion. And the transparency brought by these things like QR codes and other digital solutions goes a long way to help them, because it gives them something to bring to their community, and it gives them something to organize their community's thoughts around.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting. Also, like, this approach to different level of disclosing information and how consumers really educate themselves out of community at the end. So thank you so much, Derek. And I think that I want now to just conclude with some key takeaways from the discussion we just had. So first of all, right, we have seen that companies really need to ask where their solutions stand when evaluating a new sustainable packaging innovation. It's really important to understand where the solution stands from a technology development point of view, if the regulatory framework is favorable or no, and also how to really get that consumer opt-in into the new solution. Second of all, we also learned that packaging solutions aren't set in stone. Derek, you mentioned that from a consumer consensus point of view, all of these are in the early consensus stage and can be prone to disruption, right? And we are seeing that also when it comes to technology development that is always evolving and regulation can change throughout the years. So that was for sure an interesting one. And lastly, we believe that also consumer education should be top of mind for companies, but as Derek pointed out, maybe not in the traditional way that we are always think, but for sure try to help consumer understanding the motivation behind certain packaging innovation is really important.
All right. Matilda, Derek, thank you so much for your insights and rich discussion here. Now we're going to take about one question from the audience just because of time constraints. And if we do not get to your questions, someone from Lux will be sure to follow up with you after the webinar today. So the one question I think I'll ask for now is, so, consumers are really easily confused, or they're not willing to put in the work, right? But they're a very important piece in the equation for achieving sustainable outcomes. So in both of your opinions, what are ways to ensure consumers opt in or to get them to opt in?
Yeah, I think this is always a challenging problem. I think from a consumer-facing perspective, you can't think of more sustainable packaging as a differentiator or a selling point in and of itself. It still needs to meet those usability concerns that are sort of woven through all of their problems. So a packaging can't just be more sustainable. It has to make their lives easier. It has to secure their health or make them healthier. It has to give them access to a community. They need to feel like they're getting something else out of the packaging, especially if the opt-in requires spending a little bit more money, which it often does. They need to be getting something else, not just a sustainable solution, but something that makes their lives better, and they can see the results of that choice today, not in 50 years.
Yeah, and I'm gonna build on this, Derek, because this is a really interesting point. And, I believe that adaptability is also really important when it comes to technology innovation, right? Because we mentioned before that the packaging industry is really a conservative industry. So if you want to put in some new packaging innovation, they need to be able to some kind to retrofit in the infrastructure that we have now, and also in the way we are used to, process but also use packaging, especially if you want to see this result now. So packaging innovation doesn't have to be at all cost a new completely material, but there are some changes that companies can do now to really try to adapt the industry to new changes that can help companies then comply with regulation and meet also consumer needs when it comes to purchasing then packaging.
Absolutely. So I think that will conclude our webinar for today. Thank you, Derek, Matilda. I know we had a lot of rich learnings from both of you, and unfortunately, we've run out of time, but that concludes our webinar. The slide and presentation and recording from today will be sent to all attendees via email. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we'd appreciate any and all feedback that you may have to help improve and inform future webinars. So thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.